Today we are in northern Pomerania in Germany, and we are at the Everstorfer Forst, and there's a nice collection of megalithic structures in this forest, and this is our first visit to a passage grave. Now, a passage grave was a type of megalithic tomb that was made after they started making dolmens. And as you can see, it's a lot more elaborate than a typical dolmen. You have a nice long passage lined with these big stones, and then there's a dolmen behind me, and that's where the burial chamber would have been. And what makes the passage grave distinctive, and it's something that you only find in this area of northern Germany and in Denmark, is it has an entryway at a 90-degree angle to the rest of the passage. And you only find these type of structures in this part of Europe. So here we have this long passage grave, and then over here on the side we've got this little entranceway. Come on in the dolmen. Come on in, set a spell. Enjoy your eternal rest under this rock. So this is a really great one. Like, this place is really cool with all this moss on the stones. It's really neat. And you can see, since we just had the equinox, people come and perform pagan rituals at these sites. I think it's nice that people still use them to this day. And just like the other dolmens and passage graves in this region, they're built up on a mound. They have a ring of stones around them, and then a burial chamber in the middle. But the passage graves will have this right angle entrance. Well, if you thought that last passage grave was big, this is a big one. It took us like a minute and 30 seconds to walk completely around it. This is a huge passage grave right across this busy road from the first one that we saw. And it's made just like the other passage grave, it's just on a much greater scale. It still has the side passage for entry, but it's a lot smaller proportionally to the rest of the site than the other one was. So this tomb has 4 huge capstones over the burial chamber. And the side passage on this one, they have stones blocking it. Now, it can be hard to know if it was like this originally, because most of these structures, especially if it's all nice and pretty and lined up like this, they've been reconstructed. So to try to give you an idea of how massive this grave is, I'm at the corner at one of the guardian stones. And we've got a hill here with the burial chamber. And then the hill gets taller over here. And just keeps going. Really long. And now we're at the other end of it. You can see where we started. It's really big. Now, as I said when we were at the Long Barrow on Rugen, one theory is that these large rectangular structures are supposed to represent the early Neolithic longhouses, which were these huge wooden buildings that many people lived in. And then over the centuries, as they decayed and rotted away, people would come back and turn the place into a memorial and place stones where the wooden posts used to be. And it became a place that people could come back and memorialize their ancestors. So here's the side chamber, the side entrance of this one. And you see it's blocked by a stone. The other one wasn't blocked, and it's hard to know if it was originally blocked or if at some point the stone was moved to block the side passage. It's hard to tell, because most megalithic structures that are as organized as this have been reconstructed by archaeologists and excavated. So they put them back where they think they should go. But it's hard to know sometimes how it was originally. So they've been doing some recent logging in this area by this dolmen. So this has been all clear cut. This used to be completely forested. And so now the dolmen is just kind of hanging out with 6 trees around it. still in the Everstorfer Forst, very close to the other structures that we just saw. And in the midst of this denuded, deforested landscape, we have the Devil's Oven. Wonder what the devil's cooking. What do you think the devil's cooking, Jim?
Bread, of course.
What kind of bread?
Rustic bread.
Rustic bread. The bread that's nothing but like seeds and grains just pressed together?
No. The devil doesn't eat crappy bread.
It's healthy.
Yeah.
The devil doesn't care about healthy stuff.
He's the devil.
So the Teufelsbackofen is the local name for this structure. And isn't this dolmen adorable? I mean, this is just the cutest dolmen you could ever imagine. And it is typical of the dolmens in this area in that it's on a little raised mound. You have the curbstones all around it. You see that in pretty much every dolmen that you see up in this region, but you don't see them anywhere else in Europe. Now, the local people called this the Devil's Oven, and as we discussed when we were in France, people in the past didn't understand where these structures came from because they didn't have any memory of the Neolithic era. And so, as far as they were concerned, these stones had always been there, and they didn't know how to lift these heavy stones, so they assumed that giants must have done it or demons must have done it. But we know that people did it. It wasn't aliens, it wasn't demons, it was people. They got a bunch of people together because you finally had some people who were collecting some power and influence and extra resources. And so they could get people to come from a distance away and all gather together and build these megalithic structures as monuments, and then they would have a big feast at the end of it. And then right next to the Devil's Oven is this long barrow. It's not a passage grave though, because it doesn't have that 90-degree side chamber. But it's a long grave. And in the center, you have the burial chamber. Which really looks like a grave. Kind of disappointing that this thing is no longer surrounded by forest. I mean, I guess they're got to do what they got to do, but it's just going to be kind of out here in the open for a long time until these trees grow back, which kind of kills the mood. And people like to come and leave flowers and vegetables and other offerings at these sites still. And then they crawl around and scrawl graffiti in the dolmen because, you know, that's what people do. Hi everyone, we're coming to you today from Denmark, and we are on the northern Jutland Peninsula at the site of Tustrup. And this is a very important Neolithic site, and it's really cool, and I hope you enjoy our little trip here. Right now we are hiding inside the passage grave to get away from the wind because it is really windy out there today. But on the drive here, we passed a golf course with people golfing, so they're committed. So let me tell you a little bit about this site. This is a Neolithic site of the funnel beaker culture, the same culture that created the megalithic graves that we saw in Germany a few days ago. And this site is very unique because it has 4 monuments very close together, and they all were related. They were built in a pretty short period of time from each other. We have a round dolmen, a passage dolmen, a passage grave, and a special structure that is sometimes called the temple or the cult house. The first structure that was built is the smallest dolmen that you see here. And then the next structure that was built is this larger dolmen that you see here. And it has this really interesting structure of these almost walls, and paper I read referred to them as drywall as the sides of this dolmen. The very last structure that was built is this huge passage grave. When these structures were excavated, they really didn't find many human remains in them, so their primary use did not seem to be for burials. The site seemed to have a ritual purpose, and that goes along with the function of this cult house. Now, there were only 12 of these cult houses in this part of Europe, and they were all deliberately destroyed. And we really don't know what they did in them, but they weren't for burial. Now, this site that all of these monuments are on was just a pasture. Nobody lived here. We find no artifacts of human habitation on this hill. So this was a site that was purely meant for monuments.
Were they destroyed as Christianity moved in? No. Before that. Long before that. Okay.
3,000 years before Christianity started. The destruction of the site appears to coincide with the arrival of what is called the pitted ware culture And so maybe there was a cultural change at that point. And so the cult house was a wooden building, but it had some stone structure to it. And the house was deliberately burned down, and then they paved over the site with flat stones. And the passage grave was deliberately closed off. I mean, they purposely destroyed this site, and we don't really know why. Now, this little Bebe dolmen over here appears to have been the first one that was built, but it seems to have not been used as a tomb. No bodies were found in either this dolmen or the larger round dolmen, but the passage grave seems to have been used as a tomb. And the capstone of this dolmen is missing because it was probably taken to be broken up and used for building material in the 19th century. But there is this rock all by itself a few feet away from the small dolmen, so this could have been a capstone. I don't know how they know it wasn't. So maybe this was the capstone for this dolmen. So this is the cult house or temple. And so this was a wooden structure. And there were 12 of these in this area at one time. This one is unique though because of all of these stones that it had. Most of the other ones didn't have this many stones. But the cult house was deliberately burned down by the people who built it. All of the structures on this site seem to have been built within a period of a couple of hundred years. So they seem to have been built by the same clan or family. We don't really know about the kinship relations of the people that lived here because we found so few human remains. But it appears to have been a place for a local person of power and influence to have a site that everybody could gather together. And there seems to have been a lot of competition between different groups who were starting to get some extra resources and extra influence. And so they were almost like a building competition, maybe, of like who can build the better monuments. We don't have accurate carbon dates of these structures, but it's estimated that they were built from around between 3300 BC and 3100 BC. And that's when they were destroyed. The passage grave was originally covered with dirt. It's been partially excavated, so you have to imagine this being completely covered with dirt, and it wasn't open like this.
So did it probably have another capstone on it then?
Oh, probably. Yeah, there was probably a missing capstone. And we know that stonecutters in the 19th century, particularly, would take big capstones off of dolmens and use them. These were built in a short window of time archaeologically speaking, I mean, it was several generations of time went by that these were being built.
And all used as burial chambers, except for
No.
maybe the cult house?
They don't, well, they know the cult house was not. They have found some human remains, but they don't know if they date to when they were built, and they're not even complete bodies. A lot of times in these tombs, you only find certain bones in the tombs because they had been moved from elsewhere, and we really don't know what they were doing with the bodies at this time. The passage grave is the only one that was used as a tomb, this large structure. The other structures here do not seem to have been used. Now, this isn't the only place that they would bury people. They did have single flat graves where we find bodies from this time period. So those were probably people without any kind of status. It seems to have been people with more of a higher social status would be buried in these megalithic structures. So they would, they also left pottery in these structures, and that's the main way that we date them based on the type of pottery. The pottery that you find in these megalithic graves seems to have been broken deliberately before it was put in the grave. And we don't know what that's about, but it doesn't seem to be that they would place an entire pot in these megalithic structures.
I would assume that it's like symbolic of the person not being there anymore and some representation of a use and a person and a soul or something like that. I don't know.
No idea.
Yeah.
What, that now they're an empty vessel or
well,
something?
I'm going to use my weird Western bias and say they probably thought that there was a soul in a person, and when they broke the vessel, it was like the person dying.
Could be. I think that people don't have a real appreciation of how sophisticated people were at this time living in this area. I think people think that they were, I don't know, living in caves or something, but actually the megalithic structures are the least impressive thing that people were doing at this era. Because at this time, people were living in houses that were made of wood, of course, but they were wooden houses that were made without any kinds of nails, no metal involved in the construction of a house. Like, can you make a wooden house with no nails? In Sweden, we know that they had elaborate flint mines. People from further south on the continent started moving, the Funnelbeaker people started moving up into the Scandinavian region, and they found a rich source of flint in southern Sweden. And so they had these elaborate flint mines with many, many chambers. And it wasn't just like open pit mining. No, they were digging mine shafts. So you had an entire economy of people who did nothing but build ladders, build rope. You had to have people to feed all these people that are mining all this flint. It was a whole economy based on flint mining in some regions. And then they were trading that flint all over Europe. And then they were exchanging, for other goods from other regions. There were elaborate networks of trade and communications all throughout Europe at this time. But I don't know, I think people think that 5,000 years ago, people were eating raw meat and bashing each other over the head with clubs instead of making like elaborate mines and elaborate structures and houses. And I think that we really are doing people of the past a disservice by thinking that, that had to have been like aliens to make this. When really, if you consider what it takes to mine flint, stacking some rocks up is easy. Because with the flint mines, they know that certain shafts had to be refilled before you could make another shaft. That requires quite a sophisticated sense of engineering and ingenuity, which is where the word engineer comes from, by the way. So people were really smart 5,000-6,000 years ago. They weren't stupid. If you've ever heard of Otzi the Iceman, or Ötzi in German dialect, he was a Copper Age, but also Neolithic Copper Age from right around the same time period that this monument was built. And we went to this cute little village in Austria, which is near where Otzi was from. And they have a little recreated Neolithic village, and I'll show you some pictures that we took when we visited there a few years ago. And as you see, they had wooden houses that look like something you could live in now. They had animals. They grew crops. They grew wheat. They grew beans. But people living that kind of lifestyle were contemporary to these megalithic structures in Northern Europe. And when you look at their little village, you really see that they really weren't that primitive. And he had a bow and arrow. He had an axe. He had medicinal mushrooms. He had fire starting mushroom. He had a birch bucket that he kept embers to start a fire in. He wore clothing that was sewn. He had shoes that were made by a shoemaker. Like, these people were sophisticated. And I don't think that we do a good job of educating people of what life was really like 5,000-6,000 years ago.
It's remarkable how close all these sites are to each other. The four are probably within the size of a football field, either American or European.
Yeah, in this area, though, the monuments tend to be a little more tightly clustered than you find in other parts of Europe. Like, and it's not like you would never find clusters of monuments, because when we were in France, remember, there were a couple areas that would have a few dolmens around. But in this region, you do tend to find monuments clumped together. And remember on Rügen, at Lankengranitz, there were all of those dolmens.
Right.
Very, very close together. So that is typical of this region. And it's theorized that it was, that they were sort of, again, displays of some kind of a wealth or a power, competitive with somebody else's cluster of monuments down the road. Guten Tag from Schleswig-Holstein, and today we are at the Schalenstein, which is one of the most important dolmens in this entire state of Germany. You can see that this is a typical dolmen of the northern German Denmark region, in that it is in a round barrow with curbstones all around it. This one is very special though because of all these carvings that are on this capstone, and I'll go through them with you in a minute. This one has only been excavated from the top. They left the rest of the barrow around it. I've never been to one like this that was almost underground. It's really neat. So carved on the top of this are dozens of cupules, which we have seen on a couple of other dolmens, both in Germany and France. But it also has 4 or 5 handprints on it and a footprint, and it crossed with a circle around it. So this one is really special. Unfortunately, people don't really treat it with the respect it deserves, and acid rain is eating away at it. So the markings are getting hard to see, but you can still see them pretty good. So I'll show them to you. So here you can see some of the really cool stuff carved into this stone. Here we have handprint, another handprint, and another. Isn't there another handprint over here? Oh yeah, I see it. Yeah, here's the handprints. And then here's this circle with the cross carved into it. And then there's this indentation here that looks kind of like a footprint. See? And then it's just covered in cupules all over it. There's also this marking here that is interpreted as representing maybe water flowing down the stone. So this dolmen was probably built around 3300 BC-ish. When they excavated it, though, they found a Bronze Age grave above the center capstone with a tree, and that was from around 1700 BC.
So when they did that, they must have known this was a burial site. There was something here.
Maybe. Or it could have just been coincidence. Yeah, it's hard to know how much of it was exposed over time, but yeah, maybe they did know. And that is typical that we see burials even inside the megalithic structure from like the Bronze Age or later. But this one was on top, was above the center capstone. Now this dolmen is made of sandstone, and that's unusual for the region. Most of these structures are made of granite. But sandstone was used some. It's just not usually these huge pieces of it. This was discovered in the 1800s by some people who were digging for treasure. And so they started digging, but they didn't find any treasure. And so they were like, there's nothing here. And they just kind of left it alone until it was excavated by archaeologists in the early 20th century.